Hi, this is Stelios from the Tesseract Academy, and in this video, we're gonna talk about dynamic pricing. So what is dynamic pricing? Dynamic pricing or price optimization is the concept of offering goods at different prices, and the prices vary according to the customer. So the idea behind dynamic pricing is that not all people share the same price for a product. Some people might be willing to pay more, some people actually want to pay less. By understanding what each person's elasticity looks like, then we can find the optimal price for each individual. Dynamic pricing was first created in the 80s by American Airlines. So American Airlines, it wasn't going too well. It was actually losing significant amounts of money and was risking bankruptcy due to the invasion of low-cost competitor called People Express. So People Express was offering low prices far below what American United Airlines was offering. And American United Airlines came up with an idea which is now ubiquitous in airlines of splitting prices depending on the type of ticket and benefits that a customer basically desires. So people that had booked tickets early on would get them cheaper, and people who'd like to travel business class would pay more than those who would pay economy. So it was the first time the dynamic pricing was applied in the industry. Obviously, this is something we're all familiar with now, and we have progressed a lot since the 80s. And the reason we have progressed a lot is data. So there are different categorizations of dynamic pricing, but in my opinion, as a data scientist, these are the two main categorizations I believe are the most important. We can cluster dynamic pricing in two different types. The first type being flat dynamic pricing, and the second type being individualized dynamic pricing. So flat dynamic pricing refers to the idea of just increasing or decreasing price for all customers depending on various circumstances such as the location, the time, the event. So in a very easy to understand example, early bird tickets for music concerts, or a seasonal pricing for clothes, or London's underground peak pricing during rush hour. However, what is more exciting for me as a data scientist is what I call individualized dynamic pricing. And this is where everything is heading. We can collect data about each individual and create a bespoke offer for each individual depending on their circumstances as well as their profile. So what are the advantages of dynamic pricing? It's easy to figure out what the advantages are. First of all, dynamic pricing is a way to increase profits. We can increase profits by selling more or by capturing a larger audience, and we can also extract more value from people with lower elasticity of demand. Dynamic pricing can also create more recurrent customers. Since we're communicating, we're capturing a larger audience, a larger base of customers, then we also end up getting more recurrent customers. So Forrester suggests that you can boost your profits by 25%, but that's just one research. I've read in other kinds of research that sometimes profits could be boosted by more than that. It really depends on the industry as well as the specific way that dynamic pricing is applied. Obviously, dynamic pricing is not perfect. In some cases, it can alienate customers, which might consider it unfair, especially if they're used to other prices. This is a link, you can check the slides offline, which tells the story of a woman that had to pay a huge Uber bill because of Uber's surge feature when she hadn't realized she was actually paying more when she was booking the Uber. And this can obviously lead customers to your competition. Another problem with dynamic pricing is that it's not easy to understand the elasticity of demand for a given customer or for all your customers. It's a non-trivial problem. Obviously now with the algorithms that we have and the kind of data that we possess through smartphone devices and other types of records, this is easier than it used to be. However, it's still not a trivial problem. So how to do dynamic pricing? There are different ways to do dynamic pricing, and this is a very nice summary from this post on Medium. You can find the source at the bottom that breaks down the dynamic pricing process and basically treats it like a supervised learning problem. We start with data collection, and then we go through the pre-processing, and in the pre-processing tab you can see all the different kinds of data that we can collect on customers, like purchases by category, brand, offers, companies, context, history, all that. And Then segmentation. I mean, this is one pipeline. We don't have to do segmentation. There are other ways that we could approach the problem. And then we do regression to determine how much someone would be willing to pay. Another way to do this is basically there are two steps in the end. One is determining the price, and the other one is determining whether someone would buy or not through logistic regression. This is an example pipeline. You can read the full story here. It's a very nice post. And now let's try to break this down a bit and let's see a larger perspective of how this could be tackled depending on circumstances. So I mentioned that, at least in my opinion, the two main categorizations of dynamic pricing is flat dynamic pricing and individualized dynamic pricing or personalized dynamic pricing. So flat dynamic pricing is a supervised learning problem. This is what we saw in the previous slide as well. So we want to predict, let's say, the total sales or some related metric, and we assume that the total sales is influenced by a variety of factors, including the price. And what we have in our possession is historical sales data and exogenous factors such as the weather, the season, the prices of competitors, etc. So obviously a good way to approach this problem is an econometric model, something like linear regression, because of the simplicity of the problem. But we can also, if we want to make things more exciting, add a bit of forecasting into the mix, such as an ARIMA model. Now, individual dynamic pricing is still a supervised learning problem. However, we operate in a more granular scale. So what we care now is whether a user would buy a particular product, and there are many ways to approach this. I mean, we can ask the question whether a user will buy a specific product or become product agnostic in a sense, ignore specific labels for products and describe products as a set of features. And the kind of data we can have here, is a lot. Besides historical data, we can also use demographic data, pretty much anything we can get our hands on relating to the users. Obviously, we can use this using supervised learning. However, this could also be partially solved by using a recommender system. There are also hybrid approaches. So, for example, we're going to have some kind of hybrid between flat dynamic pricing and individualized dynamic pricing. And this is what Uber is doing, because Uber does not have a price. It adjusts prices, but not for the whole city or for an individual user. It adjusts prices depending on the time and the wider area. So we can have different prices for two areas in the same city. Also, it's possible to start from individual models, maybe individual models of what we believe are representative users, and then average these models out and use these models for the average user in order to get aggregates for the whole population. So that's another way to do this. And also something else we can do is, instead of just offering special prices, we can serve these as special offers, maybe with combination of products or different packages. Again, something that is very useful here is the predict and optimize framework, which I've talked in another presentation by the Tesseract Academy. Forecasting is also something very important in the area of dynamic pricing, because we're dealing with time series quite often. We're dealing with time series around demand, for example, or the prices of competitors. So being aware of these techniques that can be used for forecasting, whether they are traditional statistical techniques such as ARIMA or machine learning techniques such as recurrent neural networks, can be very useful, since we might want to incorporate forecasts of demand into our dynamic pricing model. And obviously, in dynamic pricing, I mentioned this a few times already, it's a very good idea to track the prices of your competitors. Obviously, there's a concern that if you're just tracking the prices of your competitors too closely and you try to beat them in price, then maybe what's going to happen is what we call a race to the bottom. Everyone's reducing the price, eliminating the respective margins, and then everyone goes bankrupt. Big data, however, offers another possibility. You obviously have a different angle compared to your competitor. So with individualized pricing and big data, you can create bespoke offers for the customers which offer the greatest value to your business. And this does not have to sidestep on the business of your competitor that much. So dynamic pricing creates new opportunities for the market. And we're going to close with an example. I believe Uber is the prime example of dynamic pricing. Most people are aware, and it really works. There's been research to validate the idea behind Uber's dynamic pricing, even if in some cases calling an Uber can be considerably more expensive because there are not enough drivers out there. It helps create this demand to get more drivers to use the app and help commuters reach their destinations. And this is some research that validates this. there was a search outage a few years ago, and you can see that around the time that Uber search didn't work, the requests spiked as well the estimated time of arrival, and at the same time the completion rate dropped dramatically. So basically what this means in simple words is that when search was out during a high demand period, this was basically around New Year's Eve in 2015, then basically the app stopped working as well as it should have, and many people were either not able to get back home or they arrived much later. So dynamic pricing can make a huge difference in Uber's bottom line, and this is the same for many other businesses. However, it's not the perfect solution. Sometimes there can be mistakes in how dynamic pricing is implemented. And again, I mentioned an example earlier on. I'm going to mention another one around Uber. There's this funny story with a person that, not funny probably for the person who had to go through this ordeal. They paid a crazy fee of over $1,000 for a 20-minute Uber ride. So this is a case of the algorithm not really using any kind of ceiling in the way it calculated cost, and the person who booked the ride was not careful enough to see what the search pricing actually looked like. So that's very bad for everyone. It's very bad for the person who booked the ride, obviously, but it's also very bad for the company because it portrays an image as a maybe irresponsible company in this regard. So we always need to be careful when we apply any kind of intelligent algorithm and not just let it run wild. We always need to monitor intelligent algorithms that we've deployed. This was Stelios from the Tesseract Academy. I hope you enjoyed this video about dynamic pricing, and I hope to see you in another one of our videos. Thank you and goodbye.